Sometimes the greatest act of love is seeing worth where everyone else sees shame. Sometimes the bravest choice is standing up for someone the world has forgotten. In the frontier town of Bitter Creek, an Apache warrior named Taza faced a cruel judge who thought he could humiliate him. Judge Morrison lined up indentured women and laughed, "Pick any wife for free." He expected the warrior to walk away in defeat. Instead, Taza pointed to Clara, the woman everyone mocked and ignored because of her size. The townspeople waited for his embarrassment, but they didn't understand what Taza saw. While they saw weakness, he saw strength. While they saw burden, he saw beauty. What happens when two broken souls find each other in a world that tried to destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Bitter Creek. It hung in the air like the town's sins, coating everything with a fine layer of grit that no amount of sweeping could remove. In the summer of 1882, this remote outpost in the Arizona Territory existed as a place where decent folks rarely lingered, and those who stayed had run out of better options. The main street stretched barely 300 yards between the saloon and the general store, flanked by weathered buildings that leaned against each other like tired old men sharing secrets. Judge Ezekiel Morrison held court in what had once been a hotel dining room, his makeshift bench constructed from shipping crates, and his authority derived more from the Colt revolver on his hip than any legitimate appointment. He was a large man, with soft hands and cruel eyes, the kind who had discovered that power over desperate people could be more intoxicating than whiskey. His gavel, a piece of oak he'd carved himself, had decided the fate of countless souls, who found themselves at the mercy of frontier justice. On this particular morning, as the sun painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and amber, Clara Whitmore knelt beside a washbasin behind Mabel's boarding house, her hands raw from lye soap and her back aching from another sleepless night on the straw mattress she shared with two other indentured women. At 26, she carried herself with the careful movements of someone who had learned to make herself small, to avoid drawing attention that inevitably brought ridicule or worse. Clara had not always lived this way. Beneath her coarse cotton dress and work-stained apron, she wore a small silver locket, the only remnant of her former life. Inside, a faded photograph showed her parents standing proudly beside their modest but respectable home in Kansas. Her father, Captain James Whitmore, wore his cavalry uniform with quiet dignity, while her mother, Eleanor, smiled with the gentle warmth that Clara remembered from childhood bedtime stories. The locket was more than jewelry. It was proof of who she had been before cholera claimed her parents and left her orphaned at 19. Without family connections or inheritance, she had fallen prey to unscrupulous men who promised work but delivered bondage. For 7 years, she had been passed from household to household, her labor sold to pay debts she had never incurred, her dignity stripped away piece by piece until she barely remembered the girl who had once played piano and recited poetry. Other women avoided her, not from cruelty, but from the superstition that misfortune might be contagious. Clara's size, she had always been what her mother kindly called sturdy, made her an easy target for mockery. In a world where women were valued primarily for their beauty and ability to bear sons, Clara had learned to expect nothing but contempt. Yet, beneath her defeated exterior, something endured. In quiet moments, she still found herself humming the hymns her mother had sung while baking bread. When she was certain no one was watching, her fingers would trace letters in the dust, spelling out words from the books she had once loved. Her spirit, though battered, had not broken entirely. 3 miles outside town, in a canyon carved by ancient waters, Taza built his fire as his grandfather had taught him. The smoke rose straight up in the still morning air, a prayer offered to the 4 directions. He was 42 years old, his black hair now streaked with premature silver, his face marked by lines that spoke of both sorrow and endurance. His English name, given by missionaries who had tried to save his soul, had long since been forgotten. To his people, he was Taza, mountain lion, a name earned through courage that seemed distant now. In his medicine pouch, he carried sacred items from his destroyed village, a piece of turquoise from his daughter's first necklace, sage blessed by his wife before she died, and a small wooden horse he had carved for the son who never lived to ride a real one. These memories drove him back to Bitter Creek, not for revenge, but for something harder to achieve: peace. Taza had spent 15 years wandering, trying to outrun the ghosts that followed him across desert and mountain. He had worked as a scout for the army, guiding the same men who had destroyed his world, because survival sometimes demanded swallowing pride. He had learned their language, their customs, their weaknesses. Now he possessed something most Apache warriors never acquired: the ability to move between two worlds without belonging fully to either. His return to Bitter Creek was prompted by a letter from Father Miguel, the old priest who ministered to anyone willing to listen. The padre had written that Captain Whitmore, the cavalry officer who had led the raid on Taza's village, was dead, buried in the town cemetery beside his wife. The news should have brought satisfaction, but instead it left Taza feeling hollow. Revenge against a dead man was meaningless. What he sought now was understanding, perhaps even forgiveness, though he was not certain he deserved it. The Apache horse he rode, a sturdy paint mare named Thunder, sensed his unease as they approached town. She had been with him for 8 years, a gift from a Navajo trader who respected Taza's skill with horses. Thunder was more than transportation. She was freedom itself, proof that some spirits could not be broken by saddle or bit. In town, word of the Apache's presence spread quickly. Some remembered him as the young warrior who had once traded peacefully at their store. Others knew only the stories, embellished with each telling of his prowess in battle. Most were simply nervous about any Indian who moved with such quiet, a confidence, who looked them in the eye without deference or apology. Judge Morrison heard about Taza's arrival while holding court over a dispute between two ranchers about stolen cattle. His interest was not professional, but personal. Years ago, when Morrison had been a civilian contractor selling supplies to army posts, he had tried to cheat Taza in a horse trade. The young Apache had not only exposed the fraud, but had done so in a way that cost Morrison a lucrative contract. Some humiliations festered rather than healed. The judge saw opportunity in Taza's return. In a town where entertainment was scarce and cruelty often passed for humor, he could provide both while settling an old score. Morrison had recently acquired 6 indentured women through various debts and legal maneuvers. Their labor was valuable, but their misery was merely a bonus. What better way to humiliate an Apache than to offer him a white woman he could never truly have, while simultaneously entertaining the townsfolk with the spectacle? As the morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows between the buildings, neither Clara nor Taza could have imagined that their paths were about to intersect in a way that would change not only their lives, but their understanding of what it meant to be truly seen by another human being. The town clock, a recent addition that kept unreliable time, chimed 10 times. Judge Morrison adjusted his coat and prepared to deliver what he believed would be his masterpiece of public humiliation. Clara finished hanging the wet laundry, unaware that her years of invisibility were about to end forever. The morning air carried the scent of sage from the surrounding hills and the promise of change that neither of them dared hope. For the crowd gathered quickly when Judge Morrison's voice boomed across the dusty street. Word had spread that something entertaining was about to happen, and in a town where the most exciting events were usually fistfights or the occasional cattle drive, any diversion drew attention like honey draws flies. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison announced from the steps of his makeshift courthouse, his voice carrying the theatrical flourish of a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. "We have a distinguished visitor among us today." His tone dripped with sarcasm as he gestured toward Taza, who stood near his horse with the quiet stillness of a man accustomed to being watched by hostile eyes. Taza had come to town for supplies, and to pay his respects at the small cemetery where Captain Whitmore lay buried. He had not expected this public spectacle, but neither was he surprised by it. White men like Morrison thrived on power displays, and Taza's presence threatened their carefully constructed sense of superiority. "This here Apache warrior," Morrison continued, "has graced us with his presence. Now I'm a fair man, and I believe in extending hospitality to all our visitors, regardless of their heritage." The word came out like something distasteful. "In fact, I'm feeling so generous today that I'm prepared to offer him something special, something a man like him could never acquire through normal means." The crowd murmured with anticipation. They could sense violence in the air, or at least humiliation, and both were rare commodities in their dull existence. Morrison disappeared into his building and emerged moments later, followed by 6 women in various states of distress and exhaustion. These were his indentured servants, women who had fallen into debt or circumstance and found themselves bound by legal documents they barely understood. They moved with the careful steps of people who had learned to expect pain. Clara was among them, her head down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her worn apron. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the cruel gleam in Morrison's eyes. Whatever he planned, it would not end well for anyone involved. "Behold," Morrison proclaimed, spreading his arms wide, "the finest selection of available wives in the territory. And today, my Apache friend, you may have your pick, any one of these lovely ladies, absolutely free of charge." The crowd erupted in laughter. The idea that any white woman would willingly marry an Indian was absurd to them, and the notion that these particular women, marked by poverty and servitude, represented the finest of anything, struck them as the height of comedy. Taza understood immediately what Morrison intended. This was not generosity, but calculated cruelty, designed to humiliate him in front of the entire town. He could walk away, that was probably what Morrison expected, and preserve his dignity at the cost of appearing weak. Or he could play along with the judge's game and face whatever consequences followed. But as his gaze moved across the 6 women, something unexpected happened. His eyes fell upon Clara, and in that instant he saw past her rough clothing and defeated posture. He saw the careful way she carried herself, the intelligence in her downcast eyes, and something else, a quality his grandmother would have called survivor's strength. In Clara's face, Taza glimpsed an echo of his lost wife, not in physical resemblance, but in the quiet endurance that marked those who had faced the worst the world could offer and somehow remained human. His wife had possessed that same dignity even when the soldiers came, the same refusal to let cruelty extinguish the light within. The medicine pouch at his side seemed to grow warm against his hip, as if his ancestors were whispering guidance he could barely hear. His daughter's turquoise caught the sunlight, reminding him of a conversation long past. She had been only 7 when she asked him why people were cruel to one another. He had told her that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was show. In kindness when the world expected hatred? Well, Morrison pressed, his smile widening. Don't be shy, take your time and choose carefully. After all, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The crowd waited, their laughter dying to expectant whispers. Several men had already begun placing bets on whether the Apache would flee or which woman he might choose if he stayed. The general consensus was that he would point to the youngest or prettiest, as if he were selecting livestock. Clara felt the weight of dozens of stares and wanted nothing more than to disappear entirely. She had endured years of mockery about her appearance, her size, her status. Being displayed like merchandise in this grotesque auction felt like the final humiliation, the moment when whatever remained of her self-respect would crumble completely. Then, she heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see the Apache warrior standing directly in front of her. His dark eyes met hers, and she expected to see the same dismissive judgment she had grown accustomed to. Instead, she found something she had almost forgotten existed: respect. "You," Taza said simply, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. His weathered finger pointed not at the youngest woman or the prettiest, but directly at Clara. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. Laughter erupted from every direction, so loud and sustained that it seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. Several men doubled over with mirth, while women whispered behind their hands with a mixture of shock and delight at the unexpected entertainment. "The fat one!" someone shouted. "He picked the fat one!" "I guess beggars can't be choosers," another voice called out, provoking fresh waves of hilarity. Morrison himself seemed momentarily stunned by the choice. He had expected Taza to either walk away or select one of the younger women, providing a different kind of spectacle. This outcome was unexpected, but potentially even more entertaining. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The laughter cut through her like knives, each cruel comment a reminder of every harsh word she had ever heard about herself. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. But when she looked again at the Apache warrior, she saw something that stopped her tears completely. His expression had not changed. There was no mockery in his eyes, no cruel joke waiting to be revealed. He looked at her as if she were exactly what he had chosen to choose, as if her worth was self-evident. "Are you certain?" Morrison asked, barely containing his glee. "Perhaps you'd like to reconsider. There are other options available." Taza never took his eyes off Clara as he answered, "I am certain." The finality in his voice cut through the crowd's laughter like a blade. Something in his tone suggested that this was not a joke to him, that he had made his choice with the same seriousness he might bring to any important decision. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, as if a door that had been locked for years was suddenly creaking open. No one had looked at her the way this stranger did, not with pity or disgust, but with a kind of recognition, as if he saw something in her that she had forgotten existed. "Well then," Morrison declared, his voice ringing with false congratulations, "I pronounce you man and wife by the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona. You may kiss your bride if you're so inclined." The crowd roared with renewed laughter, but Taza ignored them entirely. He stepped closer to Clara and extended his hand, not demanding, but offering. When she hesitantly placed her work-roughened palm in his, he helped her down from the courthouse steps with the same courtesy he might show a respected elder. "My name is Taza," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "I will not harm you." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but found herself without words. In the space of minutes, her entire world had shifted. She was no longer an indentured servant, but someone's chosen wife, though she could not begin to understand why this man had selected her or what he expected in return. As they walked together toward his horse, the crowd's laughter gradually faded to murmurs of confusion and disappointment. The entertainment had not unfolded as expected. Instead of humiliation, they had witnessed something they could not quite name. A moment of dignity in a place where such things were rare. Thunder nickered softly as they approached, her intelligent eyes assessing the new human with calm acceptance. Taza helped Clara onto the horse's back before mounting behind her, his movements economical and sure. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Home," Taza replied simply, and something in that single word made her believe that such a place might actually exist. The canyon that Taza called home lay hidden among red stone walls that rose like cathedral spires toward the endless Arizona sky. Clara had never seen anything so beautiful. After years of cramped rooms and windowless attics, the open space felt like breathing for the first time. His dwelling was simple but thoughtfully arranged, a sturdy log cabin built into the canyon wall with a covered porch that faced east toward the sunrise. Clear water ran through a natural channel carved by centuries of flash floods, providing both irrigation for his small garden and the peaceful sound of moving water that had drawn him to this place. Clara stood uncertainly beside Thunder, still, hardly believing the morning's events were real. The torn blue dress she wore, her only decent clothing, felt inadequate in these surroundings. Everything about this place spoke of permanence and care, qualities she had not experienced in so long that they felt foreign. "You are safe here," Taza said, dismounting and offering his hand to help her down. "No one will hurt you or make you work without wages." His words were kind, but Clara had learned to be suspicious of kindness. Men who appeared gentle often revealed themselves to be the cruelest once they had what they wanted. She accepted his assistance, but stepped away as soon as her feet touched the ground, wrapping her arms around herself in a gesture that had become habitual. Taza noticed her defensive posture but made no comment. Instead, he began unsaddling Thunder, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Are you hungry?" he asked without looking at her. "I have bread and some vegetables from the garden." Clara's stomach answered before she could speak, betraying the fact that she had eaten only a small piece of cornbread that morning. She nodded, then realized he might not have seen the gesture. "Yes, thank you." Inside the cabin, Clara was surprised by the cleanliness and order. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship. Woven baskets held supplies, and the walls displayed what she recognized as Apache artwork, geometric patterns in earth tones that seemed to bring the outside landscape indoors. Most surprising of all were the books. Nearly 24 volumes sat on shelves carved into the log walls, their leather bindings worn but well maintained. Clara had not expected to find literature in an Apache warrior's home, and certainly not titles she recognized from her father's library. "You read?" she asked, forgetting momentarily to be afraid. Taza followed her gaze to the books and nodded. "The missionaries taught me when I was young. Later, I found that books could teach me about the world beyond these mountains." He pulled down a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. "This one belonged to a cavalry officer who died in my village. I kept it to try to understand the minds of men who could appreciate beauty in words, but not in life." The reference to her father's profession made Clara stiffen, but Taza did not seem to notice her reaction. He moved to the small kitchen area and began preparing a simple meal: sliced bread, fresh tomatoes from his garden, and strips of dried meat that he soaked in warm water to soften. As he worked, Clara found herself stealing glances at her surroundings. Everything spoke of a man who had built this life with intention, who had chosen each item for its utility or beauty. The contrast to her recent existence in crowded boarding houses could not have been starker. "Why did you choose me?" she asked suddenly, the question bursting out before she could stop it. Taza paused in his preparation, considering his words carefully. "In my people's tradition, we believe that the spirits sometimes guide us toward what we need, even when we do not understand their wisdom." He set a plate before her, the food arranged with simple elegance. "When I looked at you today, I saw strength. Not the kind that comes from muscles or weapons, but the kind that allows a person to endure cruelty without becoming cruel themselves." Clara stared down at the food, overwhelmed by his answer. No one had ever described her as strong. For years, she had seen herself as weak, a failure who had allowed circumstances to reduce her to near slavery. "I don't feel strong," she whispered. "The strongest people rarely do," Taza replied. "They are too busy surviving to notice their own courage." They ate in comfortable silence. Clara gradually relaxing as the food and warmth worked their magic. The bread was fresh and the tomatoes sweet, simple foods that tasted like luxury after months of thin gruel and stale biscuits. After the meal, Taza showed her the small room that would be hers. It contained a narrow but comfortable bed, covered with colorful blankets, a washing basin, and a window that looked out over the canyon walls. Most importantly, it had a door that could be closed, and, she noticed with relief, secured from the inside. "You do not owe me anything," he said quietly, standing in the doorway. "Your body is your own, as are your thoughts and your words. I ask only that you not fear me unnecessarily." Clara nodded, still unable to fully believe in such generosity. But as evening fell and she found herself alone in a room that was truly private for the first time in years, she began to feel something she had nearly forgotten: hope. She discovered a small mirror on the wooden dresser and looked at herself honestly for the first time in months. The face that stared back was older than her 26 years, marked by exhaustion and defeat. Her brown hair had grown long and uneven, her skin roughened by harsh soap and constant work. The blue dress hung loosely on her large frame, its tears poorly mended with whatever thread had been available, yet something in her eyes seemed different already. Perhaps it was simply the absence of fear, or maybe it was the echo of respect she had seen in Taza's gaze. Whatever the cause, she looked more like the person she remembered being, and less like the broken woman she had become. As she prepared for sleep, Clara's fingers found the small locket beneath her dress. Inside, her parents smiled up at her from their faded photograph, reminding her of the woman they had raised her to be. For the first time in 7 years, she felt worthy of their memory. Outside her window, she could hear Taza moving quietly about his evening tasks. The sounds were reassuring, rather than threatening. The footsteps of a man going about his normal routines, rather than prowling with dangerous intentions. When he began to sing softly in his native language, the unfamiliar melody worked like a lullaby, carrying her toward the first peaceful sleep she had known in longer than she could remember. In the darkness, Clara allowed herself to wonder what tomorrow might bring. Would this kindness last, or would Taza reveal himself to be like the other men who had promised safety only to demand payment she could not afford? Time would tell, but for tonight, in this small room with its sturdy door and soft bed, she chose to believe in the possibility that her life might finally be changing for the better. The canyon walls stood guard around them both, ancient sentinels, keeping watch over two souls who had found an unexpected refuge in each other's company. Clara woke to the sound of gentle humming and the aroma of coffee brewing over an open fire. Sunlight streamed through her window, painting golden squares on the wooden floor. For a moment she could not remember where she was, and panic began to rise in her chest until memory returned. She was in Taza's canyon, in her own room, behind a door she had locked herself. She dressed quickly in her worn blue dress, running her fingers through her tangled hair in an attempt to make herself presentable. When she emerged from her room, she found Taza sitting on the porch with Thunder, speaking to the horse in Apache while he checked her hooves for stones. "Good morning," he said without looking up, his voice warm with the kind of contentment that came from meaningful work begun early. "Good morning," Clara replied, surprised by how natural the exchange felt. She had expected awkwardness after yesterday's strange beginning, but Taza's manner suggested that nothing unusual had occurred. He had prepared a breakfast of eggs from the chickens that wandered freely around the canyon floor, along with fresh bread and honey gathered from wild bees. Clara ate hungrily, amazed by the simple pleasure of food that had been prepared with care rather than obligation. "Tell me about your family," Taza said as they finished eating. "What were they like?" The question caught Clara off guard. No one had asked about her past in years, and she had grown accustomed to being seen as nothing more than a pair of working hands. "My father was a cavalry officer," she began hesitantly, "a good man who believed in protecting people who could not protect themselves. My mother taught piano and kept a garden that was the envy of every woman in town. She reached unconsciously for the locket beneath her dress. They died of cholera when I was 19. After that, I lost everything. The house, my father's pension, even my mother's piano. Men who claimed to be helping me were actually stealing what little remained. Taza listened without judgment, his dark eyes focused on her face rather than looking away in discomfort, as most people did when hearing tales of hardship. "You learned to survive alone," he observed. "That takes great strength." "I learned to endure," Clara corrected. "I'm not certain that's the same thing. In my culture, we honor those who endure," Taza said. "My grandmother used to say that anyone can be brave for a moment, but it takes true courage to wake up each morning and choose to continue when life has given you every reason to surrender." They spent the morning working together in his garden, Clara learning to identify the various plants he grew for both food and medicine. His knowledge of healing herbs was extensive, and she found herself fascinated by his explanations of how different plants could be combined to treat ailments ranging from headaches to broken bones. "The missionaries taught you to read," Clara said as they worked, "but who taught you about medicine?" "My grandmother was a healer," Taza replied, his voice taking on a softer quality. "She said that true healing comes not just from the plants themselves, but from understanding the connection between the body, the mind, and the spirit. A person can drink all the willow bark tea in the world, but if their heart is broken, the headache will return." Thunder grazed nearby, occasionally lifting her head to watch them work. Clara noticed how the horse responded to Taza's voice, how she seemed to understand not just his words, but his intentions. There was a partnership between them that spoke of years of mutual respect. "She's beautiful," Clara said, gesturing toward the horse. "How long have you had her?" 8 years, Taza replied. "A Navajo trader gave her to me in payment for helping his sick daughter. He said Thunder had never allowed anyone to ride her, but that she chose me. I have found that the best relationships are built on choice rather than force." The comment seemed directed at more than just horses, and Clara felt herself blush at the implication. Did he mean their arrangement? Was he suggesting that she had choices here, that she was not simply another form of livestock to be managed? As if reading her thoughts, Taza straightened and looked directly at her. "Clara, I want you to understand something. What happened yesterday in town, that was not a real marriage. It was theater performed by a cruel man who wanted to humiliate us both. You are free to leave whenever you choose." The words should have been reassuring, but instead they filled Clara with unexpected anxiety. Where would she go? What would she do? The possibility of freedom was terrifying when she had grown accustomed to having her decisions made for her. "I don't know how to be free," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Taza set down his gardening tools and turned to face her fully. "Freedom is not something you learn all at once," he said gently. "It starts with small choices. What do you want to eat? What do you want to wear? How do you want to spend your time? Each choice you make for yourself is a step toward reclaiming who you are." That afternoon he showed her his horse training techniques, explaining how he worked with wild animals by earning their trust rather than breaking their spirit. Clara watched in amazement as he approached a young Mustang that had been running with Thunder's herd, speaking in low, soothing tones until the animal allowed him to touch its neck. "Patience," he explained. "Force creates fear, and fear creates resistance, but kindness and patience create partnership." They laughed together for the first time that evening when one of his chickens, a particularly bold hen named Prudence, stole a piece of bread directly from Clara's hand. The sound of her own laughter surprised Clara. It had been so long since she had felt genuine amusement that she had almost forgotten what it sounded like. "You have a beautiful laugh," Taza said, and the simple compliment made Clara's heart flutter in a way she had not experienced since girlhood. As they prepared for sleep, Clara realized that she felt different than she had the night before. Some of the fear had been replaced by curiosity, some of the despair by tentative hope. She was beginning to remember what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a burden. In her room, she looked again at her reflection in the small mirror. The same tired face looked back, but something in her posture had changed. She stood a little straighter, held her head a bit higher. Perhaps this was what the beginning of freedom looked like. Not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual recognition of her own worth. Outside, the canyon settled into its nighttime quiet, broken only by the whisper of wind through stone and the distant call of a night bird. Clara fell asleep, thinking not about the hardships behind her, but about the possibilities that might lie ahead. 3 weeks into her new life, Clara stood before the mirror in her small room, wearing a dress she had made with her own hands. The fabric, a soft green cotton that Taza had purchased during his weekly trip to town, complemented her brown eyes and brought color to cheeks that had grown less hollow with regular nourishing meals. The act of sewing had awakened muscles in her memory that years of hard labor had not touched. Her mother had taught her fine needlework, and though her fingers were now work-roughened and her hands less steady, the skills returned gradually. Each careful stitch felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that she had thought lost forever. "You look beautiful," Taza said when she joined him for breakfast, and the genuine admiration in his voice made her heart skip in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. She had begun to look forward to their morning conversations. Taza was an excellent listener, who drew stories from her without making her feel exposed or judged. This morning, as they shared eggs and fresh bread, he asked about her mother's garden. "She grew roses," Clara said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality as memory transported her back to Kansas. "White ones that smelled like heaven, and red ones so dark they were almost purple. She said that roses taught patience because they bloomed in their own time, not when people wanted them to." "Like people," Taza observed, and Clara nodded, understanding that he was talking about more than flowers. Their days had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were spent working in the garden or tending to the animals. Afternoons, Taza often left her alone while he tracked mustangs or gathered healing plants from the canyon walls. Clara used this time to practice skills she had nearly forgotten, reading from his small library, writing in a journal he had given her, and slowly, carefully, learning to make choices about how to spend her hours. The solitude was a gift she had not expected. After years of being constantly watched and directed, the freedom to be alone with her thoughts felt revolutionary. She began to remember who she had been before circumstances stripped away her identity layer by layer. One afternoon, while Taza was away checking his snares, Clara heard the sound of voices approaching the canyon. Her old fears returned immediately. What if Judge Morrison had come to reclaim his property? What if other townspeople had decided that an Apache and a white woman living together was an affront that needed correcting? She quickly made her way to the cabin and retrieved the rifle that Taza kept loaded beside the door. Her father had taught her to shoot, though she had not touched a weapon in years. Her hands shook as she positioned herself where she could see the canyon entrance while remaining partially concealed. The voices grew closer, and Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Then she heard something unexpected, the sound of children laughing. A moment later she saw them, an elderly Mexican woman leading 3 young children toward the canyon spring, empty water jugs in their hands. The woman looked up and saw Clara standing with the rifle. Instead of fear, her weathered face showed only concern. "Señorita," she called in accented English, "we did not mean to frighten you. I am Maria Consuela Santos. These are my grandchildren. The spring here, Señor Taza, he told us we could come for water when our well runs dry." Clara lowered the rifle, embarrassed by her fear. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping into the open. I wasn't sure who you were." Maria approached with the careful steps of someone who had learned to read danger in other people's faces. "You are the woman from town," she said gently. "The one who chose kindness over pride." Clara blinked in surprise. I'm sorry, the story has spread, Maria explained, her dark eyes warm with understanding. How you accepted Senor Taza's choice with dignity, how you did not run when the people laughed. In my village, we know something about being looked down upon. We recognize courage when we see it. The children, 2 boys and a girl ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12, watched Clara with open curiosity but without fear. The youngest, a boy with serious dark eyes, approached Thunder where she grazed nearby and began speaking to the horse in rapid Spanish. Miguel loves horses, Maria explained. His grandfather was a vaquero before he grew too old to ride. Senor Taza has been teaching the boy about caring for animals. This was the first Clara had heard of Taza's relationships with the local Mexican families. She realized how little she still knew about his life beyond their canyon refuge. How long have you known him? She asked. 5 years, Maria replied, settling onto a smooth boulder while her grandchildren played near the spring. When we first came to this valley, we had nothing. My son had died, his wife had abandoned the children, and we were refugees with nowhere to go. The Anglo ranchers would not hire Mexicans, and we were too proud to beg. She paused to call out a gentle warning to one of the boys who was climbing too high on the canyon wall. Senor Taza found us camping by the road. We thought he might drive us away. We knew the stories about Apache warriors. Instead, he brought us food and helped us build a shelter. When little Rosa became sick with fever, he brought medicines that saved her life. Clara felt a warm glow of pride in Taza's character, followed immediately by confusion about her right to feel proud of someone she had known for such a short time. Yet something about Maria's story felt important, as if it revealed a pattern of kindness that made Clara's own rescue less unique and somehow more meaningful. He never asked for anything in return, Maria continued, but when our vegetables grow well, we share them. When his clothes need mending, I do the work gladly. It is not charity on either side. It is family. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility. Clara had not thought of herself as part of a family since her parents died. The idea that she might be welcomed into this network of mutual care seemed too good to be true. When Taza returned that evening, leading a young Mustang he had been training, he found Clara and Maria still talking while the children played in the creek. His face lit up with genuine pleasure at seeing his 2 worlds connected. I see you have met our neighbor, he said to Clara, then switched to Spanish for a rapid conversation with Maria that made the older woman laugh and pat his arm affectionately. Over dinner, which they shared with Maria and the children, Clara learned more about Taza's place in the complex web of relationships that made survival possible on the frontier. He was not just a hermit living in isolation, but a vital member of a community that included Mexican families, a few sympathetic Anglo settlers, and even some Apache relatives who visited occasionally. Why didn't you tell me about the others? Clara asked later as they cleaned up after their guests had departed. Taza considered the question while stacking clean plates. I wanted you to know that our life together was not dependent on anyone else's approval, he said finally. But now that you are stronger, now that you know your own worth, I thought you should understand that you are not just my wife. You are becoming part of something larger. The casual reference to her as his wife made Clara's breath catch. They had not spoken of their relationship in those terms since the day of Judge Morrison's cruel game. Hearing the words spoken with such natural acceptance made something flutter. In her chest, am I? She asked quietly. Your wife, I mean. Taza paused in his work and looked at her directly. Only if you choose to be, he said. In my heart you already are, but the choice must be yours, made freely and without fear. That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed thinking about choices and family and the gradual way her heart had begun to heal in this place of unexpected safety. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the canyon's dark sky like scattered diamonds, and for the first time since childhood, the future seemed to hold more promise than fear. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Clara moved differently now, with purpose rather than apology, with confidence rather than the careful invisibility that had kept her safe for so many years. When she walked into town beside Taza, for their weekly supply run, heads still turned, but the quality of attention had changed. She wore her green dress with pride, her hair neatly braided and adorned with a carved wooden comb that Taza had made for her. It was a simple thing, fashioned from a piece of oak and decorated with small turquoise stones, but it was the first gift anyone had given her in years that was meant for beauty rather than utility. "You made this?" she had asked when he presented it to her that morning, running her fingers over the smooth wood and intricate carving. "My grandfather taught me woodworking," Taza replied, pleasure evident in his voice at her obvious delight. He said that making beautiful things kept a man's hands busy and his heart peaceful. Now, as they made their way down Main Street, Clara felt the weight of eyes upon them, but no longer shrank from the attention. Some gazes held curiosity, others hostility, but she had begun to understand that people's reactions said more about them than about her. At Thompson's general store, the proprietor's wife, Helen, actually smiled at Clara, a small, cautious expression, but genuine nonetheless. "That's a lovely dress," she said quietly while Taza discussed prices with her husband. "Did you make it yourself?" "Yes," Clara replied, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you. My grandmother was a seamstress," Helen continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She always said you could tell a lady by the quality of her stitching, regardless of her circumstances. It was a small kindness, but it warmed Clara more than she could express. After years of being treated as invisible or worse, this simple recognition of her skill felt like a victory. Their next stop was the post office, where Taza collected letters from contacts in other territories, traders and friends who sent news of horse markets and weather patterns. Clara waited outside, enjoying the autumn sunshine, when she heard familiar, cruel laughter approaching. "Well, well," came Judge Morrison's voice, thick with whiskey despite the early hour. "If it isn't the happy couple, tell me, Apache, has your bride tired of playing house yet?" Clara felt her old fears rise like bile in her throat, but something else rose with them. Anger. She thought of Maria's words about courage and dignity, of Taza's belief in her strength, of the woman she was becoming in the safety of their canyon home. "Judge Morrison," she said, turning to face him with a steady voice that surprised them both. "How pleasant to see you looking so well-preserved." The sarcasm in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison's face reddened as he processed the fact that the woman he had meant to humiliate was now speaking to him as an equal. "You watch your tongue, girl," he snarled, stepping closer in an obvious attempt to intimidate her. "You may think you're too good for honest work now, but remember—" "I remember everything," Clara interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I remember how you profited from people's desperation. I remember the meals you denied us and the wages you stole. And I remember that your authority comes from fear, not respect." By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of someone openly confronting the judge. Clara could see Taza emerging from the post office, his hand resting casually on his knife handle, but she also saw his slight nod of approval. He would help her if needed, but this fight was hers to wage. "You forget yourself," Morrison hissed. "You're nothing but an Indian's whore, and everyone in this town knows it." The words were meant to wound, to reduce her back to shame and silence. Instead, Clara felt something crystallize inside her, a moment of perfect clarity about who she was and what she would no longer tolerate. "I am Taza's wife," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "And I am proud to be chosen by a man who sees worth where others see only what they lack the wisdom to value. If that makes me a whore in your eyes, Judge Morrison, then I consider it a compliment to be anything you disapprove of." The crowd murmured with surprise. This was not the broken woman they remembered from weeks past, and certainly not the response Morrison had expected. Several people actually smiled at her words, including old Pete Hawkins, who had never been known to smile at anything. Morrison's face had turned purple with rage, but before he could respond, Taza stepped beside Clara. He said nothing, but his presence radiated quiet menace. The judge might abuse desperate women and unarmed men, but he was not fool enough to provoke a warrior in front of witnesses. "This isn't over," Morrison muttered, backing away. "Yes," Clara said firmly, "it is." As they walked away, Clara felt Taza's hand brush hers, a brief touch of support and pride. "That was well done," he said quietly. "I was terrified," Clara admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Courage is not the absence of fear," Taza replied. "It is choosing to do what is right, despite the fear." That evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the canyon walls, Taza gave Clara another gift, a small leather journal bound with sinew and decorated with beadwork. "For your thoughts," he said. "My grandmother always said that writing down your experiences helped you understand their meaning." Clara opened the journal and ran her fingers over the blank pages, thinking of all the stories she might fill them, with stories of transformation and healing, of learning to see herself through kind eyes rather than cruel ones. "Taza," she said softly, "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" She looked at him, this man who had seen worth in her when she could see none in herself, who had offered her safety without demanding payment, who had given her space to heal and grow back into the person she was meant to be. "Ready to choose you," she said. "Not because I'm desperate or grateful, but because I love you." The words hung in the evening air, like a prayer offered to the vast sky above them. Taza reached for her hand, his weathered fingers intertwining with hers, as natural as breathing. "And I love you," he replied simply, "not for who you were or who you might become, but for exactly who you are in this moment." When he kissed her, gentle and sure beneath the emerging stars, Clara understood that this was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of bonds, but the choice to give your heart willingly to someone worthy of the gift. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a young Mexican boy who approached their canyon with obvious nervousness. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw him speaking rapidly to Taza in Spanish, gesturing toward town with urgent motions. When money changed hands and the boy departed at a run, she knew something was wrong. Taza stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the envelope in his hand. It was made of fine paper, the kind used for official correspondence, and sealed with red wax. Clara approached slowly, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. "What is it?" she asked. Without speaking, Taza broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As he read, his face became a mask of stone, but Clara could see the pain gathering in his dark eyes like storm clouds on the horizon. "Taza," she pressed gently. "What's wrong?" He handed her the letter without a word. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the formal script. "Mr. Taza, I hope this correspondence finds you well. I'm writing to inform you of a discovery made during the recent cataloguing of my late father's military papers. Among his effects, I found a detailed report regarding an engagement with Apache forces in the autumn of 1867, along with personal journals that shed light on an incident that has troubled my family for many years. According to these documents, my father, Captain James Whitmore, led a dawn raid on an Apache village believed to be harboring stolen livestock. The attack resulted in the deaths of several non-combatants, including women and children. My father's private writings indicate that he later learned the village was peaceful and that the livestock accusations were false. I believe, based on the location described and the timing, that this may have been your village. If so, I owe you an apology that is 15 years overdue. My father spent his remaining years haunted by this action, and I feel compelled to acknowledge the wrong that was done in his name. I would like to meet with you to discuss this matter further if you are willing. I can be reached through the Post office in Bitter Creek. With sincere regrets, Clara Whitmore. The signature at the bottom of the page seemed to blur as Clara stared at it. Her own name, written in her own hand, from a letter she had no memory of sending. But even as confusion overwhelmed her, terrible understanding began to dawn. The letter was not to Taza. It was from someone else named Clara Whitmore. Someone who shared her name and her father's rank. Someone who had discovered the same terrible truth that Clara herself was only now beginning to comprehend. But that made no sense. There could not be two Clara Whitmores with cavalry fathers, which meant, "This is from you," Taza said quietly, his voice empty of emotion. "You wrote this letter months ago." Clara shook her head desperately. "No, I didn't write this. I don't remember." But even as she spoke, fragments of memory began to surface. A drunken evening in Judge Morrison's office, shortly after her parents' death. A box of her father's papers that she had been forced to surrender to pay debts. Morrison rifling through documents, his eyes lighting up with interest at certain items. "I was drunk," she whispered, the memory returning in painful pieces. "Morrison had my father's papers. He made me go through them, looking for anything valuable. I found the reports about the Apache raids, and oh God, I was so ashamed of what my father had done. I wrote letters to try to find the survivors, to apologize." She looked up at Taza, her heart breaking at the stone mask his face had become. "I never sent them. Morrison said he would handle it, that he knew how to find the Apache families. I hoped, that maybe someone would receive an apology they deserved." "Morrison sent it," Taza said, understanding flooding his voice along with something darker. "He kept the letter for months, waiting for the right moment to use it. The cruelty of it took Clara's breath away. Morrison had orchestrated everything, from the public humiliation in the town square to this moment of devastating revelation. He had known exactly who she was when he forced her into that lineup of women. He had known that Taza was the survivor of her father's attack, had probably planned from the beginning to use this information to destroy whatever happiness they might find together. "Your father," Taza said, his voice barely above a whisper, "killed my wife, my daughter, my son who was not yet born." Each word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of pain across his features. "He burned our homes and scattered our people to the winds." Clara felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The blood-stained letter in her hands became the heaviest thing she had ever held, weighted with the deaths of innocents and the destruction of the man she loved. "I didn't know," she said, though the words felt pathetically inadequate. "I swear to you, I had no idea you were, that my father was—" "But you knew," Taza interrupted, his voice gaining strength and terrible clarity. "You knew your father had killed Apache families. You wrote this letter because you knew he had done something unforgivable." The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow. Yes, she had known her father was involved in actions that haunted him. She had seen the guilt in his eyes during his final years, had heard him wake crying from nightmares he would never discuss. But she had never imagined that the man she now loved was one of his victims. "The locket," Taza said suddenly, his gaze fixing on the chain around her neck. "Show me the photograph." With trembling fingers, Clara opened the small silver locket and held it toward him. Inside, her parents smiled out from their faded portrait, her father proud in his cavalry uniform, her mother gentle and kind. Taza stared at the image for a long moment, his breathing shallow and rapid. When he looked up, his eyes held a pain so deep that Clara felt it in her own chest like a knife wound. "I remember that face," he said. "Your father. He spoke to me after the attack, when I was dying beside my wife's body. He asked if I had any last words, any message for the spirits. I told him that someday the spirits would demand justice for innocent blood." Clara's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. The man who had raised her with love and gentle wisdom, who had taught her to read and ride horses and treat all people with dignity, That same man had destroyed Taza's world as completely as Utiv. Hers had been destroyed by disease and circumstance. I understand now, Taza said, stepping back from her as if her proximity caused him physical pain. The spirits did not guide me to you out of love. They brought you to me for justice. No, Clara whispered, reaching toward him. That's not what this is. What we have, the love between us, that's real. That's not about our fathers or the past or... How can I look at you and not see his face? Taza asked, his voice breaking. How can I touch you and not remember my wife's blood on my hands? How can I love the daughter of the man who made me? A ghost among my own people? The questions hung in the air between them, like unbridgeable chasms. Clara felt something fundamental tearing inside her chest, not just her heart, but her very understanding of who she was and what her life meant. I'm not my father, she said desperately. You know me. You know who I am. I thought I did, Taza replied, and the quiet devastation in his voice was worse than shouting would have been. But now I don't know anything anymore. The silence that followed stretched between them like a vast desert, broken only by the whisper of wind through the canyon walls and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Clara stood frozen, the letter still clutched in her hands, watching. As the man she loved wrestled with demons she had unknowingly brought into their paradise. Taza walked away from her slowly, his movements those of a man carrying an unbearable weight. He stopped beside Thunder, running his hands along the horse's neck with the automatic motions of someone seeking comfort in familiar ritual. But even the horse seemed to sense his turmoil, stepping restlessly and whickering with concern. Taza, Clara began, but he held up a hand without turning around. I need time, he said, his voice hollow. I need to think. Clara watched him walk toward the canyon wall, where a narrow path led up to a high ledge, a place she had seen him go when he needed solitude. With each step he took away from her, she felt their carefully built life beginning to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. She sank onto the porch steps, still holding the cursed letter that had destroyed everything. Through her tears, she read it again, searching for some detail that might change its meaning, some hope that she had misunderstood. But the words remained unchanged. As damning as before. Hours passed. The sun climbed toward its peak and began its descent toward the western rim of the canyon, painting the red stone walls in shifting shades of gold and shadow. Clara remained on the steps, alternating between periods of numb shock and waves of grief so intense they left her gasping when Maria Santos arrived with her grandchildren for their weekly water gathering. She found Clara weeping silently into her hands. Mija, the older woman said gently, settling beside her on the steps. What has happened? Through broken sentences and bitter tears, Clara told her everything. Maria listened without judgment, occasionally reaching out to smooth Clara's hair or squeeze her shoulder. When the story was finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, watching her grandchildren play by the spring. Love, she said finally, is not a thing that can be destroyed by the past. It can be tested, yes, it can be wounded. But if it is true love, the kind that sees the soul rather than the surface, it endures. How can he forgive me for being my father's daughter? Clara asked. How can I ask him to forget that my blood is connected to his greatest pain? You cannot ask him to forget, Maria replied wisely, but you can ask him to remember who you are, separate from who your father was. You can remind him that love is a choice we make every day, not a feeling that happens to us. What if he chooses differently now? What if this changes everything? Maria smiled sadly. Then you will have learned something important about love, that it must be freely given, or it is not love at all. But I do not think Senor Taza is a man who loves lightly or changes his heart easily. As evening approached, Maria gathered her children and prepared to leave. Be patient with him, she advised Clara. Men sometimes need to wrestle with their pride before they can listen to their hearts. And be patient with yourself. Grief has its own timeline, and healing cannot be rushed. After Maria left, Clara remained on the porch as darkness fell around her. She lit a lamp and sat in its yellow glow, writing in the journal Taza had given her. The words came slowly at first, then in a flood. I understand now why my father was haunted. I understand the weight he carried, the guilt that ate at him like a cancer. But understanding does not change what happened. It does not bring back Taza's family or erase the pain that my father's choices caused. What I can do is choose differently. I can choose to honor the dead by living with compassion. I can choose to break the cycle of hatred that binds the past to the present. I can choose love, even when love seems impossible. If Taza cannot forgive me, if he cannot separate me from my father's sins, then I will accept that choice. But I will not run away. I will not disappear into shame and self-pity. I will stand, hear and face whatever comes, because that is what love demands of us, courage in the face of heartbreak. Near midnight, she heard footsteps on the path, and looked up to see Taza emerging from the darkness. His face was drawn with exhaustion, his clothes dusty from his climb, but his eyes no longer held the wild pain she had seen that morning. He sat beside her on the steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, but far enough that they were not touching. For a long time they sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the canyon. "I went to the place where my grandmother is buried," he said finally. "I asked her what I should do." Clara waited, hardly daring to breathe. "She reminded me of something she used to say. The sins of the father are not the sins of the child, but the child may choose to heal what the father broke." He turned to look at Clara, and she saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "You are not your father, Clara. You are the woman who chose kindness when the world offered you cruelty. You are the woman who saw my pain and tried to heal it without even knowing its source." "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered, "for what he did, for the pain you've carried, for bringing this into our life." "Stop," Taza said gently. "You are not responsible for your father's choices. You are only responsible for your own." He reached into his shirt and withdrew something that caught the lamplight, his war lance, the weapon that had belonged to his father and his father's father. Clara had seen it only once before, mounted on the wall inside his cabin like a shrine, to his warrior heritage. "This belonged to my ancestors," he said, holding the lance across his knees. "It has tasted the blood of many enemies, has been carried into battles fought for honor and survival. For months I have thought about using it to seek revenge for my family's deaths." Clara's heart clenched with fear. Was this his choice, to honor his ancestors by claiming justice for their murders? "But tonight," Taza continued, "I realized that carrying this weapon in anger would make me a slave to the past. It would bind me to hatred and prevent me from building the future I want, the future we want." With deliberate ceremony, he stood and walked to the edge of the porch. Then, with a motion that seemed to require all his strength, he hurled the lance out into the darkness. Clara heard it clatter against the canyon wall and fall silent among the rocks below. "I choose love over vengeance," he said, returning to sit beside her. "I choose you over the ghosts that have haunted me for 15 years. Clara felt something break open in her chest, not with pain, but with overwhelming relief and gratitude. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Once this choice is made, I am certain," Taza said firmly, "but there will be those who cannot accept it. Judge Morrison will not be satisfied with simply revealing the truth. He will use it to poison others against us, to turn the town against our union." Clara nodded, understanding. Morrison's cruelty was not satisfied with private suffering. He would want to make their pain public, to use their love as entertainment for his own twisted pleasure. "What do we do?" she asked. Taza took her hand in his, their fingers intertwining. "With the natural ease of two people who belong together. We face whatever comes," he said, "together." As they sat holding hands in the lamplight, Clara felt something shift in the very air around them. The revelation that should have destroyed them had instead forged them into something stronger. They were no longer two wounded souls seeking healing. They were partners prepared to stand against whatever forces tried to tear them apart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of their canyon home, love had chosen itself over hatred, and the future suddenly seemed full of possibility once again. The confrontation came at high noon 3 days later, orchestrated by Judge Morrison with the theatrical flair of a man who understood that public humiliation required an audience. Clara and Taza had ridden into town for supplies, expecting nothing more than the usual mixture of curious stares and whispered conversations. Instead, they found half the population of Bitter Creek gathered in the town square, their faces expectant and hungry for drama. Morrison stood on the courthouse steps like a preacher preparing to deliver a sermon about sin and damnation. Beside him, a table had been set up with documents spread across its surface, papers that Clara recognized with a sinking heart as her father's military records and personal correspondence. "Citizens of Bitter Creek," Morrison announced, his voice carrying easily across the crowd, "we are gathered today to witness the resolution of a grave deception that has been perpetrated in our midst." Clara felt Taza's hand tighten on hers as they stood at the edge of the crowd. Several people turned to stare at them, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. She recognized Helen Thompson from the general store, old Pete Hawkins, and Maria Santos, with her grandchildren pressed close to her skirts. "This woman," Morrison continued, pointing dramatically at Clara, "has lived among us under false pretenses. She has allowed us to believe she was an innocent victim of circumstance, a poor orphan deserving of our sympathy. But the truth is far more sinister." He lifted a document from the table, waving it like a weapon. "This is a military report filed by Captain James Whitmore in the autumn of 1867. It details a raid he led on a peaceful Apache village, resulting in the deaths of women and children. Captain Whitmore was this woman's father." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some voices expressing shock, while others carried the excited edge of people witnessing a scandal unfold. "And this man," Morrison gestured toward Taza, "is a survivor of that massacre. The woman he has taken as his wife is the daughter of the man who murdered his family." The murmur grew louder, more agitated. Clara could see faces in the crowd hardening with disapproval and disgust. The romantic story of the Apache warrior and his chosen bride was being rewritten as something twisted and unnatural. "Judge Morrison," Clara said, stepping forward despite the fear that made her voice tremble. "You speak of deception, but the only deception here is your own. You knew the truth when you forced me into that public display. You orchestrated this entire situation for your own entertainment." Morrison's smile was cold and satisfied. "I provided the opportunity for truth to emerge, nothing more." "Truth?" Clara's voice grew stronger as anger began to overcome fear. "Then let me speak the whole truth." She moved to the center of the square, positioning herself where everyone could see her clearly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand straight and speak with the clear voice she had been practicing in their canyon home. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she began, "and yes, Captain James Whitmore was my father. I loved him, as daughters love their fathers, but I was not blind to his flaws. I knew he carried guilt about actions he had taken in service to his country. I knew those actions haunted him until the day he died." The crowd had grown quiet, drawn in despite themselves by the unexpected dignity in her voice. "When I discovered the details of what he had done," Clara continued, "I was horrified. I wrote letters of apology to Apache families, hoping to offer some acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done in his name. Judge Morrison took those letters and used them as weapons, just as he is using my father's sins against me now." She turned to look directly at Morrison. her brown eyes blazing with righteous anger. "But I will not be shamed for loving a man who chose me freely, and I will not apologize for being loved in return. The only person responsible for my father's actions is my father. The only person responsible for Judge Morrison's cruelty is Judge Morrison himself." Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in her words. Many of them had children or parents whose actions they could not control, whose choices had brought shame or hardship to their families. "Furthermore," Clara said, her voice rising with passion, "I challenge anyone here to show me a single cruel act committed by the man you call my husband. Show me evidence of revenge or violence or hatred. You cannot, because none exists. Taza has shown this community nothing but peaceful intentions and generous assistance to those in need." Maria Santos stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face set with determination. "She speaks the truth," the older woman declared in her accented English. "Senor Taza saved my family when we had nothing. He has never asked for payment, never demanded gratitude. He is a good man." "A good man?" Morrison scoffed. "He's an Apache warrior who has deceived us all. Do you think his peaceful behavior is genuine, or do you think he's been planning revenge all along? Now that he has the daughter of his enemy in his power, what do you suppose he intends to do with her?" The crowd stirred uneasily at this suggestion. The idea that Taza might be using Clara as an instrument of delayed revenge appealed to their sense of dramatic justice, while simultaneously horrifying them. "You want to know what he intends?" Clara asked, her voice cutting through the murmur like a knife. "Then ask him yourself. Taza, tell them why you chose me." All eyes turned to the Apache warrior, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. He stepped forward with the same quiet dignity he had shown that first day in the town square, his dark eyes moving slowly across the gathered faces. "I chose Clara," he said simply, "because when I looked at her, I saw strength where others saw weakness. I saw dignity where others saw shame. I saw a woman who had endured cruelty without becoming cruel herself." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard, and the crowd fell silent to listen. "Judge Morrison speaks of revenge, but revenge is a poison that destroys the one who carries it more than the one it targets. I have carried hatred for 15 years, and it brought me nothing but emptiness. Clara taught me that love is stronger than vengeance, that healing is more powerful than harming." He paused, looking directly at Morrison with eyes that held no fear. "The judge wants you to believe that I am dangerous, that I am using Clara for some dark purpose. But I ask you this: what has my presence in this community brought? Have I stolen from you? Have I threatened your families? Have I shown anything but respect for your customs and kindness to your children?" Several heads nodded reluctantly in the crowd. Even those who harbored prejudice against Apache people could not deny that Taza had been a model neighbor. "The truth," Taza continued, "is that Judge Morrison cannot bear to see love triumph over hatred. He cannot accept that two people marked by tragedy can choose healing over revenge. His cruelty depends on keeping people trapped in cycles of pain and suspicion." Clara felt a surge of pride at his words, at the calm way he faced down the crowds. Suspicion with nothing but truth and dignity. This was the man she had fallen in love with, not despite his strength, but because he used that strength to protect rather than to harm. Morrison's face had turned an alarming shade of purple as Taza spoke, his carefully orchestrated humiliation beginning to backfire. "Pretty words," he snarled, "but words are cheap. Actions speak louder, and I have proof of this man's true intentions." He reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with string. "Letters," he announced triumphantly, "written by Apache warriors to their allies, planning attacks on white settlements. Letters that came into my possession through official channels, and letters that mention this man by name." The crowd stirred with renewed unease. Even those who had begun to warm to Taza's words now looked at him with fresh suspicion. Maria Santos stepped closer to her grandchildren, her protective instincts overriding her loyalty. Clara felt her heart sink. Morrison had been planning this revelation all along, saving his most damaging evidence for the moment when Taza's honest words might have swayed the crowd, but Taza did not look surprised or frightened by the accusation. Instead, he smiled, a small, sad expression that held no bitterness. "Show them," he said calmly. "Read the letters aloud so everyone can hear exactly what they say." Morrison hesitated, clearly not expecting this response. He had counted on the mere suggestion of correspondence with hostile Apache forces to damn Taza in the crowd's eyes. Being challenged to provide specifics was not part of his plan. "Read them," Clara echoed, moving to stand beside her husband. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it properly." With obvious reluctance, Morrison untied the bundle and selected a paper from the top. "Brother," he read aloud, "the soldiers grow fewer each season, and their supplies run low. The time may come when we must choose between surrender and starvation. I have seen what surrender brings to our people, death by degrees in places they call reservations. Perhaps it is better to die as warriors than to live as beggars." He looked up expectantly, but the crowd's reaction was not what he had hoped for. Several people looked puzzled rather than outraged. "Continue," Taza said quietly. Morrison selected another letter, his confidence visibly flagging. "Cousin, I write to tell you that Three Hawks has chosen the reservation. His children were starving, and he could not watch them waste away. I do not judge his choice, but I cannot follow that path. I will take my family north to the mountains, where we can live free even if we live briefly." The crowd was growing restless now, sensing that these letters contained more desperation than menace. Old Pete Hawkins cleared his throat and spoke up. "Judge, them letters sound like starving people trying to survive, not warriors planning attacks." "There's more," Morrison insisted, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. He read several more excerpts, each one revealing the same theme. Apache families faced with impossible choices, men trying to protect their loved ones in a world that offered them no good options. "These letters," Taza said when Morrison finally fell silent, "were written by my cousin and my uncle. They were found after they died of hunger in the mountains, choosing freedom over the reservation system that killed as surely as bullets, but more slowly." He looked around the crowd with eyes that held profound sadness but no anger. "Judge Morrison presents them as evidence of my violent intentions, but they tell a different story. They tell of a people destroyed not by war, but by despair, not by hatred, but by the loss of everything that made life worth living." Clara felt tears burning in her eyes as she understood the full scope of Morrison's cruelty. He had taken the final words of dying men, letters that spoke of love for family and the impossible choices forced upon them, and tried to twist them into evidence of savagery. "You want to know why I chose love over revenge?" Taza continued, his voice growing stronger. "Because revenge would make me like the men who destroyed my world. It would turn me into someone who uses others' pain as a weapon, someone who finds entertainment in human suffering." His gaze fixed on Morrison with unwavering intensity. "Someone like you, Judge Morrison." The words hung in the air like a judgment. Passed by a higher court, Morrison stood frozen, still clutching his bundle of letters, his face cycling through emotions as he realized his carefully planned destruction of Taza and Clara had instead revealed his own character to the entire community. Helen Thompson stepped forward from the crowd, her voice clear and firm. "Judge Morrison, I've seen enough. This man and his wife have done nothing but live peacefully among us. The only person here spreading poison and pain is you." "Amen to that," Pete Hawkins added, and several other voices murmured agreement. Morrison looked around desperately, searching for allies among faces that had grown cold with disgust. "You're all fools," he sputtered. "You'll regret this when—" "When what?" Clara interrupted, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "When we continue to live quietly and help our neighbors. When we raise children who know both cultures and—" bridge the gap between them. When we prove that love is stronger than hatred." She reached into her dress and withdrew something that caught the sunlight, 2 silver coins that Taza had earned trading horses. "We came here to buy supplies and to live our lives in peace. But if this community cannot accept us, we will find one that can." Taza nodded and reached into his pocket, producing matching silver coins. With deliberate ceremony, he began shaping the metal with his hands, his strong fingers working the silver like clay. The crowd watched in fascination as he fashioned 2 simple rings, the silver taking shape under his skilled touch. "Clara Whitmore," he said formally, offering her one of the rings. "Will you be my wife, not in the eyes of corrupt judges or cruel crowds, but in the sight of heaven and earth, bound by love, freely given and faithfully kept?" Clara felt her heart soar as she accepted the ring and slipped it onto her finger. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent square. "Before God and all witnesses, yes." They kissed then, in the dusty street of Bitter Creek, while the crowd watched in silence. It was not the kiss of a public spectacle, but of 2 people claiming their right to love each other despite a world that had tried to tear them apart. When they separated, Clara looked out over the assembled faces and saw something that filled her with hope. The expressions of hostility and suspicion had been replaced by thoughtfulness, even respect. Judge Morrison's attempt to destroy them had instead revealed the strength of their bond and the poverty of his own character. "Come," Taza said quietly, taking her hand. "Let's go home." As they walked toward their horse, Maria Santos stepped forward and pressed a small bundle into Clara's hands. "Bread for your journey," she said softly, then added with a smile, "and for your new beginning." Other hands reached out, not to stop them, but to offer small gifts and whispered blessings. Helen Thompson squeezed Clara's shoulder. Pete Hawkins nodded respectfully to Taza. Even some who had arrived as enemies seemed moved by what they had witnessed. Judge Morrison stood alone on the courthouse steps, his papers scattered by the wind, his authority as empty as his character had proven to be. He had sought to destroy love, and had instead revealed its power to transform not just individuals, but entire communities. As Clara and Taza rode away toward their canyon home, their silver rings catching the afternoon sunlight, they carried with them the knowledge that they had faced the worst the world could offer, and emerged stronger, bound not just by love, but by the courage to defend that love against all who would tear it down. 6 months later, Clara sat on the familiar porch of their canyon home, her hands moving steadily as she wrote in the journal that had become her daily companion. The morning sun painted the red stone walls in shades of gold and amber, just as it had on that first day when Taza brought her to this place of refuge and healing. But everything else had changed. The woman who lifted her head to watch a hawk circling overhead bore little resemblance to the broken servant who had once knelt beside wash-basins and accepted cruelty as her due. Clara's brown hair, now clean and carefully braided, caught the sunlight like polished wood. Her green dress, the third she had made with her own hands, fit her fuller figure with pride rather than shame. Most significantly, her eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own worth and would never again accept less than she deserved. The journal in her lap contained the story of their journey together, written in her careful script for children not yet born who might someday wonder how love could triumph over hatred, how healing could emerge from the deepest wounds. Each page documented not just events, but the gradual transformation of 2 souls who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves. "Today marks 6 months since the confrontation in the town square," she had written. "Judge Morrison left Bitter Creek 3 weeks after his public humiliation, his authority as thoroughly discredited as his character. The territory appointed a new judge, a fair man who treats all people with equal respect regardless of their heritage. Our garden flourishes under Taza's patient care and my eager assistance. We have expanded it to include roses like the ones my mother grew, their white petals perfuming the canyon air with memories of love and beauty. Taza says they remind him that some flowers bloom most beautifully after the harshest winters. The sound of horses approaching drew Clara's attention to the canyon entrance, where she saw a familiar procession making its way toward their home. Maria Santos led her grandchildren on their weekly visit, but today they were not alone. Behind them rode Helen Thompson and her husband, along with 3 other families from town who had become regular visitors to the canyon refuge. What had begun as curiosity about the Apache warrior and his wife had evolved into something more meaningful. Taza's knowledge of healing plants had proved invaluable to settlers struggling with injuries and illnesses that the town's aging doctor could not always treat. Clara's ability to read and write had made her a teacher for children whose parents had never learned such skills. More importantly, their home had become a place where differences could be bridged, where Apache traditions and frontier customs could coexist in mutual respect. Children played together regardless of their heritage, learning songs and stories from multiple cultures. Adults shared knowledge about everything from horse training to herbal medicine, building the kind of community that could thrive in the harsh beauty of the territory. "Clara!" young Miguel Santos called out as he dismounted from his horse with the confident movements of a boy who had been learning riding from a master. "Did you see Thunder's new foal?" She had indeed seen the young horse, born just 2 weeks earlier to Thunder and a wild Mustang stallion that Taza had been training. The foal was the perfect blend of its parents' best qualities, Thunder's intelligence and her father's wild spirit, gentled by patient handling into something magnificent. "I saw her this morning," Clara replied, setting aside her journal to embrace the boy who had become like a nephew to her. "She's growing stronger every day." Taza emerged from the stable where he had been working with the foal, his face lighting up with the genuine pleasure he always showed when their friends arrived. Age had touched his temples with more silver, but happiness had erased the lines of grief that had once marked his features. He moved with the easy confidence of a man at peace with himself and his choices. "Welcome," he said, greeting each visitor with the courtesy that had become his trademark. "Clara has made fresh bread, and there is news from the Apache families who visited last week." As their friends settled around the porch and yard, Clara brought out food and listened to the comfortable chatter of people who had learned to see past surface differences to the human hearts beneath. Helen Thompson discussed her daughter's upcoming wedding, while Maria shared gossip from the Mexican settlement. The men talked about cattle prices and weather patterns, including Taza's opinions with the respect due to his years of experience reading the land's subtle signs. It was during this pleasant gathering that a rider appeared at the canyon entrance, a young Apache man whose horse showed the effects of hard travel. Taza rose immediately, recognizing something urgent in the newcomer's posture. The man spoke rapidly in Apache, his words bringing a look of profound emotion to Taza's face. When the conversation ended, he turned to address the assembled group. "My cousin brings word from the reservation," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "The government has agreed to allow Apache families to return to traditional lands, provided they live peacefully and integrate with existing communities. They are asking for guides and mediators who can help bridge the gap between cultures." Clara felt her heart swell with understanding. This was the opportunity they had been unconsciously preparing for, the chance to use their hard-won wisdom to help others navigate the complex terrain of cultural healing. It would mean traveling, Taza continued, looking directly at Clara. Living among different communities, helping families adjust to new ways while preserving their heritage. It would not be easy. Clara rose and moved to stand beside her husband, her hand finding his with the natural ease of long practice. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," she said simply. "But we've learned that healing is possible, that people can choose love over fear if someone shows them the way." Their friends nodded in understanding and support. What had begun as an unlikely love story in a dusty frontier town had grown into something larger, a model for how different peoples could not just coexist but thrive together. As the sun set over the canyon walls that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Clara and Taza sat together on their porch as they had countless times before. But tonight felt different, charged with the anticipation of new adventures and the satisfaction of work well done. "Do you remember?" Clara asked, her fingers tracing the silver ring that had been forged from simple coins into something precious. "What you said about seeing strength where others saw weakness." Taza smiled, his weathered hand covering hers. "I remember everything about that day," he said, "but I think I understand it better now. I wasn't seeing something in you that others missed. I was seeing something in you that you had forgotten was there." Clara leaned against his shoulder, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "We both forgot, I think, but we remembered together." In the distance, thunder nickered softly to her foal, the sound carrying across the canyon like a lullaby. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that love could, indeed, conquer hatred, that healing was always possible for those brave enough to choose it. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary they had built together, two souls who had once been broken beyond repair sat in perfect contentment, living proof that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply seeing worth where everyone else sees shame, and choosing to nurture that worth until it blossoms into something beautiful enough to change the world.